let nature take its course. It's nature's way of thinning the herd. People, when they say that, they tend to mean it rhetorically. They kind of want to say that, drop the mic, and walk away. And so we never get to have the conversation of, well, will it?
For people who don't really know what the state wildlife veterinarian does and what the state wildlife health biologist does, if you guys want to just unpack kind of your role and what that kind of encompasses within your day-to-day job and as it goes throughout the year.
So we both work in the research division, which is a support division. So we provide support to our fish and wildlife and other, law enforcement, education, all the big divisions. We provide support to them. So one of the things that I do is it's technical support, helping with anesthesia. I write the prescriptions. I'm the veterinarian of record for our 5 fish hatcheries, our bear team, our deer research. And so there's this technical component. I also do surgeries from time to time, like transmitter implant type surgeries. And then technical advice as we develop management plans for species or have disease outbreaks. How are we going to respond to that? What do we need to do to make sure that we're managing, both responding to disease, but also managing in a way that promotes healthy, viable populations for the long term?
Okay, gotcha. And AJ?
And so I'm her left-hand woman, but I mainly oversee the monitoring and surveillance of chronic wasting disease in the state. That's kind of my big thing for pretty much most of the year. Like 85 or 90% of my job is really geared towards that.
Gotcha.
She's a logistics guru.
Logistics, yes.
Yeah, she's humble, way too humble.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to break down kind of more. I know we want to talk about CWD. For our listeners, if you guys heard a couple weeks ago, our episode we did with Wes, the elk biologist and coordinator for the state, we went into it a little bit, but I know there were some more questions that came out of that from our listeners, as well as some things that you wanted to address. And so that's where I want to go. But to start, just overview, when we talk about disease and amongst wildlife in the state of Arkansas, like what are we talking about? What does that look like, and how does that happen within the state of Arkansas, and kind of where has that popped up in different populations?
So when we think about disease in wildlife populations, there's a certain level of disease and parasitism that is perfectly normal. That's going to be a normal part of the ecology. But what we're seeing more and more as we've changed our environment and become a more globalized society, we're moving pathogens around at an unprecedented rate. So they're emerging in other parts of the world and moving here and there and everywhere. And so we have this constant risk of new diseases being introduced. And so the first thing we do when we look at these is we have to ask ourselves, is this a disease that poses a risk, a long-term population level risk, not so much individual animals, but population level? And is it something that needs to be managed, or is it something that they will be able to naturally respond to? And there's diseases in both categories. So we have a lot of examples. Chronic wasting disease we detected in 2016. About 5 years ago, we had our first cases of sarcoptic mange in black bears. We've also had a long-standing issue, as the entire eastern half of the country has, with white nose syndrome in bats. But even things like reptiles and amphibians. Disease is one of the leading causes of declines on a global scale for reptile and amphibian populations. So we just incorporate those considerations into the bigger picture of how we manage wildlife. Because I don't think of it as like there's disease management and then there's wildlife management. It's just an integrated, multidisciplinary approach to conservation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I'm glad you brought up the mange. Actually, we got through our bear hunt a couple weeks ago, and we had a small, I wouldn't say cub, but a small young bear came in, and it was just almost completely hairless. It more than a bear, it looked like a werewolf to me. I mean, it's a very interesting look. What causes something like that within bears?
So it's a mite, and it causes itching and inflammation in the skin. And then as that worsens, they can get secondary bacterial infections. They tend to lose their hair. What we know from research on the East Coast, because they have that issue out there as well, is that as far as we know, about 80% of those bears are going to recover on their own.
Really?
And treatment doesn't really improve that. You're going to lose a percentage even if you try to treat. There's a lot of issues with trying to treat free-ranging wildlife that we can get into, but all in all, about 80% of them are going to recover on their own. And then we kind of want to know what the drivers are, because we've had sarcoptic mange on the landscape for a long time. We've had bears on the landscape for a long time, but we have this thing called the disease triad that for a disease to occur, you have to have a pathogen that can cause it, you have to have a host that's susceptible to it, and you have to have an environment that brings those together in the right way to cause disease. So the fact that we're just now seeing these cases emerge when everything has been in place for so long tells us that one of those things has changed. And so we have ongoing research trying to figure out what it is that has changed that's allowing that interaction to have a different outcome than it, as far as we know, used to.
Yeah.
And so because we have that research going on, if folks can tell us that they have bears with mange, that's extremely important to us, because we can collect samples from them that can aid that research.
Okay.
So it's pathogen, environment. What was the third one in the
Host.
triad? Host. So the bear species in this example would be
Yes.
the host.
The host.
Yes.
Okay. And you were saying it's been on the landscape, like you'd have a coyote or something with
Yeah.
mange. You're
And-
trying to figure out how is it going from that now to a bear when it wasn't beforehand?
And if it's even the same mite.
Got it. Even the same type of mange.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in that example, one, as a hunter, I saw that animal and I was like, man, is that a sick bear that I need to take out of the population? But what I'm hearing you say is that bear's probably going to recover and be okay and not have mange. You said 80% of the time?
Yes, as far as we know. Those numbers come from different populations in the East, so
Okay.
we're extrapolating a little bit. But as far as we know, it should recover. So we don't remove bears unless they're so severely affected and emaciated that they, clearly look like they're falling into that 20%. Otherwise, we try to let them recover on their own as best we can.
Gotcha. Okay. That's good to know. I was going to ask you when and you can relate it back to the mites and the bear, but when we think about like diseases and as they emerge and they come to new places where maybe they haven't been before, what are some of the factors that go into that spread of disease or kind of these hot spots that pop up in different places where maybe they weren't before?
So I have a global answer for that, and then I have a local answer.
Okay.
So on a global scale, we have more people on the planet than we've ever had. We have more livestock trying to feed those people, and we're losing habitat at a dramatic rate. And that is bringing, on a global scale, wildlife, livestock, and people into contact in ways that they have never come into contact. And they're passing pathogens every direction between those. People to wildlife, wildlife to people, livestock, every direction. And that's what we would refer to as a spillover event. So you can have diseases or pathogens that have always been there, but they were pretty quiet, didn't cause a lot of trouble, and now they're spilling over into new species because of these contacts that they haven't had before. So that's a spillover event. That turns into an emerging disease elsewhere when we add into that the globalization that we have. We move people, animals, and goods also at an unprecedented rate.
Yeah, constantly.
And there's a concept called pathogen pollution, that we're moving pathogens with that. So that accelerates the potential for and the rate at which we introduce new diseases into areas. They can be in domestic animals, they can be in people, they can be in goods or the movement of wild animals or parts of wild animals themselves. There's a lot of ways that pathogens can move. And once they're introduced into a new population, then we go back to that local answer, which is the disease triad. That's a new pathogen introduced. Is there a susceptible host? Is there an environment that will bring them together in a way that produces disease?
Gotcha.
What are some of the common spillover diseases that people may recognize or you're very aware of that we need to be aware of?
Well, in the state, I would say rabies is still probably our most significant spillover disease. I think people would be surprised to know how many people are exposed and have to be treated for rabies every year in the state of Arkansas.
Do you know that number? off the top of your head?
I don't, but I suspect it's higher than people would guess.
Yeah.
So the Department of Health does our testing, and Dr. Rothfeld would have that information.
And mostly people are exposed through, like, I think of being bitten by a raccoon. That's just like what goes on in my head.
Bats, believe it or not.
Really?
Bats and skunks.
Well, that's gonna scare my wife.
Yeah.
Bats flying overhead, she ducks
Yeah.
every time. She's out.
Or adding in like a domestic, like a dog, into that triangle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dog gets it from a bat or a skunk.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and then it goes into your home
Yeah.
because it sleeps in your bed.
Yeah. That's no good.
Sweet.
What are some of maybe some other diseases? I know you've got a sheet here with some different data, and you were talking about bats and how that we're seeing less and less bats. I just heard you mentioning that a minute ago. What other kind of diseases do we see in the state of Arkansas?
Well, so the bat declines are associated with something called white nose syndrome, which is a fungal infection that we believe was probably introduced by people recreationally caving. It was first seen in like a commercially open cave in New York. And so we think it was introduced there, and it has spread since. And our bats are not well adapted to it at all because it came from another part of the world. And so, we've seen huge declines in endangered species listings as a result. I got some numbers from our bat biologist, and he's reporting, local extirpation or a localized extinction of little brown bats and significant declines, upwards of 80-90% in a species called tricolored bats.
Wow. That's sad.
Yeah.
It is, because they're a really critical part of the ecosystem. They, in our karst areas with our caves, they're the ones that go out and bring nutrients back into that system in a really important way. And so when we have fewer of those, we have less things eating bugs, which is no good. And then it has the potential to really dramatically change the ecology of the caves, where they're kind of a keystone species.
Mm. And then when you have something like that, where there's a removal of a species within a region, does that then lead to other issues within, as it relates to disease? And now you have more insects, so now you have other diseases get transported. Is that how that works?
It can.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have to. Other issues could be, in certain parts of the world, bats are critical for insect control, or they can be critical for pollinating in other parts of the world, moving seeds, moving pollen. So it just depends on what species it is and and what their role in the ecosystem is.
Yeah. Okay. One that we haven't mentioned yet, except just for a little bit, is chronic wasting disease. And obviously it's probably at the top of everyone's list, as it's the one that's most recognizable. Deer hunters know about it. They think about it. They're scared of it. I have to imagine. I know, speaking from our side of things, it's like, man, I want that stuff to stay as far away from our deer camp as we possibly can get. And so just a brief overview for anyone who doesn't know what chronic wasting disease is, or CWD. What is it, and why is it so prevalent in today's society?
So what it is a prion disease. It's caused by a misfolded protein. It's a uniformly fatal disease of cervids, and the reason it's become so prominent is I guess twofold. We've now discovered that it has been introduced into more areas than we previously recognized. Lots of states were doing surveillance, but none of us were probably doing enough surveillance historically to detect it. And where it reaches a prevalence, upwards of 20-30%, you really start to see negative population level effects. So your deer herds start to actively decline at that point. And there's more and more places, but it takes a really long time to get to that point. But there's more and more places that are having that experience now, and so there's a lot more attention being drawn to it.
So as hunters who hear about it, and you're saying that it's more prevalent, and we're seeing it pop up in different places, is that the reason why you think that it's so talked about and publicized? Or I guess the question I'm asking is, why is this one different than other diseases that have occurred in white-tailed deer or other animals? And why are people so scared of this one, I guess?
Because I think it's because it's a prion disease, and there's so many unknowns when it comes to prion diseases. We have experience with scabies, and we have experience with mad cow disease, which is a prion disease that ultimately did, even though lots of people consumed that meat over a period of time, a few people didn't make it through that process. I mean, the result was their death. So since there is many unknowns with prion diseases, the CDC is making the recommendations to not consume the meat if it's positive. So and then to have your animals tested if you're hunting in an area known to have CWD, because they don't really ultimately know, despite the fact that the research right now is kind of mixed as far as can it be transmitted to humans or not.
I think in addition to that, I agree. I think the public health concerns are very much part of the reason it's gained so much notoriety, but also it's difficult to manage. It's very difficult to manage. And some of the management approaches that we have to take are not compatible with the most popular ways to manage deer in the absence of CWD. And that's honestly, I think, just created some conflict in the management community and the deer hunting community, because we're at a point where we have to make some really hard choices that we never really guessed we would have to make.
What are some examples of those hard choices?
Well, I think baiting and feeding is probably one of the most prominent things. It's become a very culturally accepted practice. Interestingly, it wasn't that prominent really before the 80s and 90s, but in the time since then, it's become the main way a lot of people hunt. But we know that it can increase disease transmission, and it's really problematic. And so, and a lot of people make money off of it. I don't think there's any reason to not point that out. It's
commercially selling bait. Is that what you're saying?
Baits and feeders, there's
Gotcha.
and even doing research on baits and feeds, or writing management plans about how to use baits and feeds. There's a lot of people out there with an economic interest in continuing that practice, and so that just creates controversy.
I remember even the 3-point rule being taken away because of CWD, and being a pretty big fan of it, kind of growing up on it. And I was in college. Yeah, I think I was in college when we found CWD in the state, being pretty disappointed. I was like, oh man, we're going to lose all the big deer because this was great and all of that. But then as we've been educated on it and talking with people like you and other biologists, we're understanding it may actually be younger bucks that can transmit it easier and quicker, and they range farther and all this kind of stuff. So it's a necessary practice, especially if you find a deer that might have it, or it looks like it may have it, or all of that kind of stuff. So even something as simple as the 3-point rule going away, I could see a lot of people would get frustrated about that, because we're trying to be a big buck state and we want to get there. And then you take baiting away, who's your weekend warrior guy who's trying to get his 6-year-old in the first year, how I grew up doing it. And all of a sudden you're thinking, are we like, they can't do that. Like they're not allowed to do that. And like, I get the spirit of it, and I get the frustration, but it's kind of a don't lose the forest for the trees deal of, we're trying to take care of a whole population, which is what y'all are tasked with.
Yep.
Which is a very difficult job, because you have millions of opinions, or at least hundreds of thousands in the state of Arkansas that probably think their opinion is absolutely right.
Yeah.
So many people. Yeah.
So many.
I'm sure that's half of the challenge of your job, is dealing with public perception and opinion and educating. When someone has an opinion that they believe is correct, it's I'm sure very hard to change that opinion. And when you take away something like the 3-point rule that people are in favor of, or baiting, people can get upset. I'm sure you deal with that all the time. Am I right?
Yes. Yeah.
Regularly. Yeah.
Feels a lot of
but
those.
I mean, on the flip side, I've had lots of conversations with folks that, experience you took my 3-point rule away and you took my baiting away for part of the year. I mean, and you start to talk to them about the science that's behind those management recommendations and all of the other states and the best management practices that are developed out of the South. I mean, you start to talk, okay, I see that. I might not like it, but I see it.
Sure.
And when you start talking, just like you said, about the fact that we're not talking about that one deer that's in your backyard that you want to kill to put on your plate, we're talking about an entire herd in a whole state, then it's like, okay, I can accept that.
Yeah.
So with that, what are some of the public perceptions of it currently, and how are y'all helping to educate people, kind of get the word out, get the broad message of CWD to the mass public? Where are y'all at, and then how are we, and I'll say we as kind of general hunters, how are we missing it?
Well, for us, it's like the way I look at it, at least, Jim might look at a difference. It's where the rubber meets the road. So it's our staff wearing our emblems. And so we do our best to try to communicate with them and educate them as far as CWD goes, because they're the ones that's at the gas stations and at the coffee shops and at the co-ops that have these conversations daily. That's the way I feel it's best to try to educate hunters. I mean, we put out lots of information in our in brochures and in our guidebook, but I mean, the guidebook's the guidebook. It's really, who you talk to on a regular basis.
Right.
We've actually done 2 social science surveys asking hunters what their perceptions of CWD were, and we could tell between the first and the second one we had moved the needle in terms of, or as a society, the needle has moved. That people are more aware of it. They knew more about it. I think if there was a place that folks were missing it, a lot of times it's not taking the time to read up on it and inform themselves until it's right in their backyard. And then it's kind of a jolting experience, but we ask folks where they want to get information about CWD in those surveys. And, they like our guidebook. We keep a very up-to-date website. We do webinars and outreach events, and we talk to folks like you because podcasts were actually listed on the second round of surveys when they weren't on the first one. So, yeah, it's a growing media.
Yeah, it definitely is. I was going to ask, this was something kind of going back to Wes's episode. After we did that one, we had a listener reach out or just kind of say in some of the comments, isn't it known that elk were the reason that CWD showed up in Arkansas? Because if you think about the location, when we were talking with Wes, it was actually in the Ponca Nature Center yard that they had the first case.
That was the first whitetail
case.
Yeah.
And so the question is, well, how did it get there? That's like not on the edge of the state, like it's in the middle. So, and just, coincidentally, the elk are there, or maybe it's not a coincidence. I think that was the point that some people were making isn't it known that the elk brought it here?
It's not known. I can't say that it did or honestly that it didn't. There's no way to know where it came from at this point. That is a potential route, but we know that there were other animal movements. We know that it can also be moved in carcasses. The interesting thing about the elk reintroduction in Arkansas, it happened earlier than a lot of other states that have moved elk. So for context, I mean, I think we moved elk from 82 to 85.
Yeah.
And the very first paper describing CWD ever from a captive facility was only published in 1980.
Okay.
So there was no frame of reference for the risks that this would pose. And there was really no understanding of where it was distributed in Colorado and in the West at that time, because it was really only known from a very localized area. So what I can say is it actually has really interesting origin implications if it came in our elk, because that would have meant it was much further distributed in the early 80s than was recognized at that time. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to lay blame or fault in folks that moved these elk not knowing risks that nobody understood at that time.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. I mean, that's where my head goes. It's like, well, there wasn't enough information back then. So even it's hard to put blame on it, like you just said.
Well, that, and you're looking at 30-something years from when elk were first here to when it was first found in Arkansas.
Yeah.
And part of you goes, if it is as fast of a moving as a disease as we understand it to be, it probably is going to show up quicker than 30 years or 30-something.
But can it live that long? Like prions, to my knowledge, they can live very long, and they can be slow to take shape and cause this disease.
But they don't live. They can't die.
Okay.
They can be denatured.
Yes.
Wait, unpack that.
Yeah. Help us. We are not scientists over here, so.
The prion is not alive.
Okay.
So it thus can't be killed.
Okay.
It's a misfolded protein. So the building blocks of life. Remember, go back to science class.
Some ribosomes and some mitochondria.
Yeah, there's all that stuff.
Just think
the powerhouse of the cell.
The actual prion is a misfold. The diseased version is actually a misfolded prion. And what ends up happening is it just ends up getting replicated within an animal's body, and then ultimately causes cell death. But during that process, in all the species, they're able to distribute or to
Shed it.
Shed, thank you.
Shed.
The prions through urine and feces and saliva, all of that type of stuff, and thus be able to spread it also during that time. So kind of diverted from your original question, but yeah.
But it does take a long time to build up
that was where I was going
in
with
a
that.
population and also in an individual. So in a population, you expect to have this long period of time, maybe 50 to 100 years even, where you have this really low prevalence, and then sometime at the end, it's going to start to have a really dramatic increase, an exponential increase. And
Okay.
so that's one of the things that I think is hard for folks to understand is they hear they have CWD and it's at a low prevalence and they expect there to be a big effect. And 2 or 3 years down the road, they haven't seen that big effect. And so they're like, well, I guess it wasn't that big a deal, except the scale's off because the concern we have is another 50 years down the
It's
road.
ecological
from that.
time, not
Gotcha.
our time.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And then that may cause someone to, well, I focused on it for 2 to 3 years. I'm going to abandon my
And we're
good
actually seeing
practices.
that in our testing for especially the CWD testing drop-off containers that are within the Tier 1 county. So the mainly affected counties, they are, those submission rates have dropped dramatically, like almost 50% in a
Really?
couple of the freezers, yeah.
Okay.
So we think that exactly what we just talked about, that, you don't see it, then you kind of forget about it. Well, I tested a couple years ago and I don't have it, and they're done.
When it could be slowly building up even more and more
That's correct.
over that same amount of time.
Correct.
And 5 years from now, you may be in a whole different place.
Or 10.
Interesting. So when it comes to disease and what can be controlled and what should be controlled, I think there's a sentiment. I know we talked about this, Jen, before we started recording. Is why don't we just hands off and let nature deal with it? Like what can nature do to address this? And why don't we just let it? Like, okay, Mother Nature has always kind of self-corrected and got us to where we are today, seemingly. But should we even do anything with it, or do we just let it run its course and the strong will survive and the weak die off?
I like this question because I get this comment so often, and I'm sure so does AJ, that, let nature take its course. It's nature's way of thinning the herd. It'll run its course. And people, when they say that, they tend to mean it rhetorically. They kind of want to say that, drop the mic, and walk away. And so we never get to have the conversation of, well, will it? What does that really look like? And so thinking about that same curve where it stays low for a while and then climbs over 50 to 100 years, that's a long time. What does that look like? We know that it won't have a big dramatic effect at the beginning, but we also know that that's the time that we can use hunting to suppress and keep that prevalence low. If we let it get up to a prevalence in the neighborhood of 20 to 30% or above, we start to see negative population effects. And it's much harder to control once it gets to that point. And so what does that look like? We know that, yes, species will always try to adapt and they will try to evolve in the face of new challenges. We also know that there are numerous documented cases of species going extinct due to disease in modern times, probably more than we've documented. But some pathogens are just particularly nasty and nature does not respond well. We've also changed nature. We've inhibited their ability to respond. We've loaded them down with other challenges at the same time, and we can overrun the system. But in the long run, extinction's not predicted for CWD. But what is predicted is that as that prevalence gets high, the population is going to get smaller, it's going to be younger, and it's going to tolerate but not thrive in the presence of a high prevalence of this disease. And I think sometimes when folks say, well, let nature run its course, they kind of picture, well, eventually this disease will fizzle out. That's never a predicted outcome for CWD. So if this is a multiple choice test, that's not on the list.
Yeah.
So, but that's a form of adaptation because the ecology can permanently change in a way that allows the species not to go extinct. And that, in a manner of speaking, is successful adaptation. But we know that when that happens, the population's vulnerable to other things that can, a bad hemorrhagic disease outbreak or buffalo gnat outbreak, a harsh winter can knock them back. They're going to have a harder time responding. It may not support the same ecological functions the species has always had. It may not support the same cultural functions that we expect of whitetail deer or the economic benefit that comes from that. So are we willing to accept that outcome? In the long term, what we will hand down to future generations is a smaller, younger population of deer that persist but don't thrive in the presence of a disease. Or if we're not okay with that, then we have to find a way to intervene. And so, I mean, that's kind of the crossroads that we're at, because that's where we're headed. Are we okay with that, or are we not?
Yeah. And how do you interact with the public on that? Like, when we all get together in a room, or figuratively, like, how do we agree with what we're okay with and what we're not, and who's even at the table, right?
That's a much harder question. You know, I think when you really go through that list, I've never heard anyone actually respond with, yeah, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, let them die. Let them get small and young, and we'll see what happens.
So, you know, but then the disagreement or agreement kind of turns to, well, then what do we do? Mm-hmm. I think once people really see that bigger picture for the long term, but, you know, as a state conservation agency, our job is to manage in trust a public resource, not only for current generations, but for future generations. And so I think in that light, in the light of the North American model, we have an obligation to hand down the healthiest, most resilient wildlife populations that we can.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
What does intervention, potentially look like with something like CWD?
Do you want to take that one?
Implementing exactly what we've done in the state here, or in our CWD management zone, to reduce the number of animals generally on the landscape, because less deer means less possibility of transmission. Reducing the age class structure, so older age class animals are more apt to have it, and then to remove the 3-point rule that we talked about, gives an opportunity for those young ones, the ones that are most apt to move to disperse off of the landscape, and reduce baiting and feeding. I know we talked about that. I feel like there's missing one.
Targeted removal.
Targeted removals. Yeah. There's a lot of research being done around going in and removing the actual, when your prevalence is really low, to removing the family group that's associated with the animal that tested positive. And we're actually implementing that in the state.
Gotcha.
So you find one that is positive, and then find known, I guess, herd around it, family group.
Yeah. So, like, for example, Felsenthal National Wildlife Refuge 2 years ago had its first positive detected right in the middle of the National Wildlife Refuge. And we ended up partnering with USDA APHIS to go in and remove animals from, I think it was a 2-mile radius, 3-mile radius, 2-mile radius from that original positive. And of course, all of that was public ground, so they were able to go in and do that. We do the same concept on outliers associated with our current management zone.
Okay.
But we're working with private landowners at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a strategy. It's not a broad scale culling. It's a very fine scale removal of high risk individuals around known positives. And that's a method that's been applied in multiple other states and has been shown over the long term. If you can go in and do outliers and address outliers multiple years in a row, you can actually keep that disease prevalence low.
Interesting. I want to go back to something you were talking about a minute ago, Jen, when you were talking about this is not a predicted outcome. This is a predicted outcome. Currently, with everything that we know, what do you feel like within maybe probably a range of statistical significance and variance, what do you think like the predicted outcome is? And then what factors can affect that, up or down?
So I hesitate to throw out the predicted outcome because we're going to have so much better information about this so soon.
Yes.
We're actually...
And you reserve the right to learn as time goes on and we have more research.
So we're actually in the third year of our agency's biggest research project ever, where we have collared deer on the landscape in our high prevalence area, and we are measuring exactly what CWD is doing to our deer herd. And it's the first time a study like that has been done in the southeastern U.S. And so everything else that we talk about, we have to extrapolate from either the upper Midwest or from the western U.S. that's had a much longer track record, but largely in mule deer, which are acutely sensitive to CWD. So I think smaller and younger, unfortunately, as the prevalence gets higher, smaller and younger is probably as specific as I would get.
Okay.
How much smaller and how much younger? And that's not to say there wouldn't be any older bucks or does on the landscape. We're just talking in averages because
Right.
as the prevalence gets high, more and more deer just have a shorter life expectancy. We know that the year-to-year survival of a deer with CWD is about half that of a deer without CWD in the same area. So you're talking in terms of averages. So we're doing that work right now, and we're going to build the model, and we're going to predict the outcomes. So rather than me just guessing at it, I would say, stay tuned.
Give me some time.
Because that's going to be a much better answer. Because right now we're having to extrapolate, but we're really breaking ground on measuring that directly, and that's exciting.
Even just to frame up like best case scenario to worst case scenario, like are we talking extinction to it will go away completely, or within that, like where do we fall, best and worst?
I think what it'll hinge on is at some point the prevalence we would expect it to plateau. Where it plateaus is going to really, I think, be important. And then the reproduction that our deer can have in response to that is going to be a very important factor. We know that fawns born to does with CWD can be born now with CWD.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
And
I did not know that.
Research that the state of Arkansas participated in, by the way.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Proud of our state.
Wow.
And so
Way to go, guys.
us, Tennessee, and West Virginia all contributed samples to that. So a deer born with CWD, let's say it takes 12 to 18 months to develop full-blown clinical disease. That's right about the time she should be reproducing the first time. So is she going to reproduce and replace herself before she succumbs to CWD? That's kind of a race.
Yeah.
And so the ability of our population to reproduce, to replace the increased mortality is going to be the factor that really determines what happens to our population in the long run. And I wouldn't say that getting rid of the disease or extinction are either one going to be predicted outcomes. So those are kind of extremes.
Yeah.
It'll be somewhere in between. It'll really hinge on our population dynamics. And our best case scenario, and I can't emphasize this enough, we need new tools. But there is so much research happening, and we need even more research. But that's what I hold out hope for, is that we can develop new tools. If we can put a man on the moon, surely we can figure out new tools to manage CWD. And I think that's where I still have hope.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask a question that I know it's a controversial area, and it's something that again, within the comments of some of our last posts, someone made a comment, and it's something that I think is worth addressing. But there's also this other idea around, or the sentiment around, well, if we continue, we're only contributing or participating in CWD research because there is a financial benefit that goes to the agency for research.
These are not our thoughts, by the way.
I'm just
so
painting
we're
with a
clear.
broad brush here. Yeah. So, my question is that true? And why does that sentiment exist, do you think? And how much of that is true that because we participate in research, Game and Fish gets more funding, and so we're just perpetuating the issue to get more funding?
You're the one that looked at grant numbers today.
I did. I prepared for this one a little bit. I don't know where that idea comes from, but there is certainly this idea that somehow states, when they detect CWD or if they have it, that there is this magical pot of money that just comes to states when they find CWD.
I mean, originally, back before it was detected in our state and many other states, there was money from USDA given to help us to help fund testing in the state.
Yeah.
So I think that might be the ultimate route, but that money dried up a really long time ago.
Okay.
And it was never that much, and it
No.
was very specific to just paying for tests.
Tests, yes.
Okay.
It's not like buying trucks and gear
No.
and equipment.
No.
So the thing I hear is, lining the coffers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where people got that idea. So we detected CWD for the first time in 2016.
Right.
I looked back at the numbers. We had no input of new funds for the first 4 or 5 years. It was 100% paid for out of the same pot of money that we use for all of our wildlife management activities. And that's a combination of state and federal money, but that pot doesn't change based on CWD. There's no extra money for that. A few years ago, again, USDA started another program where you could apply for some grants to do very specific projects. And we obviously, because we're having to invest all of this money into addressing CWD, we feel like it's necessary to properly manage the resource. We wanted to offset some of that. So we do apply for those grants when we have opportunities. Sometimes we get them, sometimes we don't. What I can tell you is big picture. When I look at all of our expenditures for research, for management, surveillance, staff time, all of it, and then I look at our grant input, we've recovered maybe not quite 10% of what we've totally invested.
In CWD?
In CWD specifically. Okay. So, and I was gathering those numbers today. So those are loose estimates, but there's not a lot of money. We're trying to minimize the financial burden so we don't have to pull resources away from other management activities. So we do try to get that money, but, we're just trying to offset what we have to invest in it. And we really haven't been able to offset that much. So certainly nothing on the order of what people accuse us of, that there's this big pot of money, that it's a financial incentive. We spend a lot more than we're able to recoup on CWD, but we do it because we feel that it's necessary to properly manage this resource that's been entrusted to us. But the other thing I really want to emphasize is when people say it's about the money, that's when I know they don't get it. They don't get the level of threat that this poses to the resource. Because if we had our way, any of us, there is no amount of money in the world that would make it worthwhile to have CWD. Mm-hmm. I think we would probably give any amount of money to make it go away. Mm-hmm. There's just no amount of money that makes it worthwhile to have this level of threat to our resource.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if I can kind of recap what you just said, we're doing the research, we're spending the money already from the pool that we have. Essentially, by applying for these grants to get additional money, it's to recoup and cover the costs of efforts and initiatives that are already in place.
Yes.
And it's not going to gear and new trucks and higher salaries and
oh, heavens no.
Cool toys.
The legislature determines our salaries. And no, you usually can't buy equipment with this. If you do, it's a freezer or an incinerator. That's very specific to CWD. So it goes into one of two things. Sometimes it passes straight through us to universities and we don't keep any of it. Sometimes, like you say, we're able to pay for something that we'd already budgeted for, which allows us to put that other money back into other wildlife management activities. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it allows us to do something like communication. We've gotten a cooperative agreement the last few years that has allowed us to do more communication with the public in the form of public awareness campaigns to help encourage people to test. We would not have been able to advertise or reach the public in that way without that money. So, but it was very specific to, it just went to increase media awareness of testing options.
You had said something earlier that I thought was really important and insightful, of just how much CWD even takes away from the rest of efforts when it comes to conservation and other wildlife management and what y'all do for your jobs. And I guess just kind of thinking a small pivot, when you think just the state of Arkansas, wildlife as a whole, what are the things that, A, we haven't asked you about yet, and B, you think is really important to communicate just to our listeners and anybody who may pick this up along the way?
Oh, goodness. Well, it's a really exciting time at Arkansas Game and Fish. We have a new strategic plan. We have a fairly new director. He's been there 2 years. And, we've got a new private lands division. Arkansas's 90% private lands. And so I think those guys are going to do some amazing things for the face of conservation in Arkansas. I guess the big picture I would say from a wildlife health standpoint is whether you're a hunter or just a person who spends a lot of time outdoors, or a wildlife watcher, a birder, if you see something unusual, report it, because maybe it's nothing, maybe it's something. But, people who care about conservation and care about the resource, they can be our eyes and ears on the ground, and they can be in a million places at once that we can't. So that would be my big ask.
Yeah. as far as kind of expanding on that, like just in general, the role of the hunter and the angler as it relates to conservation, as it relates to the health of wildlife in our state, like AJ, what do you see the role for the hunters, the common hunters and anglers?
Be it the observation surveys, participating in those. I mean, we've got deer, turkey, quail, I think, and then sick animals. I mean, for CWD specifically, target or sick animals, ones that aren't acting right, those are most valuable samples anywhere in the state. Doesn't matter where it comes from. Those are our most valuable samples. And then just general, hunting, continuing to actually hunt, because that is the management. And then for me, again, back to CWD, if you want to participate in the overall management, submit that head, because a negative sample is just as important to me as a positive one. So participating in those management strategies and those sampling strategies is important for a hunter, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not moving carcasses.
And not moving
That's
carcasses.
a huge one.
Yeah.
Because once CWD prions are in the environment, we don't know the outer limit of how long they can remain infectious. We know for a related disease of sheep and goats, scrapie, it's 17 years, at least 17 years. Soil chemistry probably influences that. We're starting to do research on maybe how prescribed burning would or wouldn't affect that. But when we measure that environmental persistence, it's not in like weeks or months. It is years, possibly decades. So once you've introduced it, by throwing a carcass away, throwing away the pieces you don't want, it's there. It's there for a long time.
And it's not just deer. I mean, it's any species. I mean, keep it local. I mean, shop local, keep it local. I mean, it's,
dispose local.
Dispose local. I mean, it's the same thing, because it's moving anything all the way back to the beginning. Putting together that perfect triangle of environmental, species, and
Yeah, you could be introducing something
Yep.
to complete the triad.
Exactly.
The dreaded triad of doom that you didn't mean to, right?
And it might be a turkey taking it home to your chickens in the backyard. It might be a deer moving CWD, or, I mean, there's a bunch of examples that could go on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the overused analogy of the perfect
ticks.
storm.
I mean, we won't even talk about ticks. We never even talked about ticks.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows?
You just think about all the chickens that are being driven down the road with open carriers, and all the livestock, and then all the deer hunters and all the turkey hunters and everything moving around.
I think Arkansas.
Rivers even.
Yeah. There's a concept called One Health that kind of emphasizes the interconnectedness of human, animal, wildlife health. And I think Arkansas is a great place that for better or worse, we live that out every day, because so many of us are so connected to the land. We're farming, we're raising our own food. My family lives a very sort of field to table lifestyle. And so I think Arkansas, we're the natural state, and with that comes a interconnectedness that we have to be aware of.
Yeah, that makes sense. As far as challenges go with managing a wildlife population and the health of that population, it's not like you can just go out and treat this mangy bear with a nice warm oatmeal bath and shampoo and all the stuff to make him, get rid of the mites. How challenging is that to actually implement the science and the research that you guys do on the landscape?
It is really challenging, but it actually goes back to that same disease triad, because in the same way that those three things have to come together to cause disease, you can focus on those three things to manage disease. You can manage the environment, you can manage the host, or you can manage the pathogen. And so you have to get creative. You have to understand the ecology that brings them together and look for ways to intervene in those cycles. It's hard to do, but I think we're getting new technologies all the time. People have really thought outside the box on how to do that historically. And so it's just a different approach. I don't work like a lot of my other veterinary colleagues on an individual animal. So I just think about that disease ecology very differently.
Mm-hmm. As far as the tools that you mentioned, new technologies, advancements, what are some of the things that have either already come or are coming that you're excited about?
I'm excited about options for environmental treatment that I think will be groundbreaking for CWD. I think that is probably one of the most pressing needs. Thinking about other diseases, you know, screwworm eradication in the U.S. That was something that was done in the early 20th century. That
What was that?
it's a parasite that was eradicated mostly actually for livestock, for the benefit of livestock, but they had a really unusual, this fly had a really unusual life cycle that it would only reproduce one time. And so they actually released sterile males into the environment to flood the system, and they were able to use the ecology of that parasite to eradicate it. And they actually, USDA continues that eradication program at the Panama Canal to this day to keep it from coming back into North America.
Wow.
So it's really cool.
So that's an example of some new advancements or just new methodologies.
Well, it's not really new.
Okay.
That was an older one, but I think that was a really creative way to understand the ecology of a species to break those disease cycles. In terms of the new technologies, the things that they're able to do with disease modeling now and transmission models just blow my mind. I think that's some really cutting edge work that, you know, they can actually model out, okay, well, if you do this harvest strategy, what happens to the population in 50 years? And if you do this harvest strategy, what happens to the population in 50 years? And so those are the kind of models we're leaning into so we can make decisions now and predict their outcomes way down the road.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like with CWD, it's within the triad leaning towards host and environment with how you hunt, how many you take out, and the environment of how condensed are they, how do we not bait, all of that kind of stuff. Am I right in that assumption?
By George, I think he's got it.
It took this whole time, but it clicked. I was like, got it. Those are the two. Because it's not like we're going to, I mean, it'd be amazing, but you're not going to come up with, let's say, a miracle powder that you can sprinkle in the air that like eradicates the prion disease. I mean, you maybe could, but
well, we don't have that yet. But I mean, that would be, yes, right now we're focused on the
Those are
host
the-
and
those
the
are the two.
environment.
Okay.
But down the road, if we're able to come up with an environmental treatment, then we would switch and we could be focusing on the pathogen, at the
pathogen.
same time.
so that would be some of the new technology that you're either excited about to come in the future, or there may even be some ground level workings on it that you do get excited about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And that would be like an example of an environmental treatment would be if this was something that we talked about with Wes, but it was like prescribed burning.
yeah.
If that were to be proven that actually,
Helps.
helps and decreases the prevalence or the spread of CWD, that would be an example of
The
it.
availability of the prion is what the proposal would be that it reduces that availability
By burning.
by burning and getting it at the soil level, going back to what Jen was saying earlier.
Because the prion can survive in the soil. So like when you dispose of a carcass, the prion can go, not survive. I'm already saying it wrong.
It's not a bug.
See, he saw me bite my lip. That's what he did.
Exist in the soil and remain infectious.
Mhm.
Is that right?
Yes. So in certain soils, it's more infectious, and in certain soils, it's less infectious. But what it does is it can travel up plants. And so herbivores can pick it up by actually grazing. So knocking it back down from the plant level back into the soil, depending on your soil type, could make it less available or immediately available for consumption and uptake by the host.
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha.
But we know that there are other, I mean, it's not indestructible. There are chemicals that we can use to denature the prion in a lab setting.
Mhm.
You know, there's recommendations for soaking your knives if you're hunting. You know, there are things that can denature this protein in a lab setting, in a kitchen, in a controlled setting, finding ways to see how we can apply that on the landscape if there is a way.
Yeah.
But you know, they've even found things like lichens can break down proteins. So I mean, again, getting really creative about what we can use as tools.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Man, so much interesting stuff. I'm like, feel like I'm getting a seminar at a university here.
I'm just glad I finally got it, man. For that an hour.
Man, I'm proud.
Yeah.
You did
Well,
good.
it's like I'm understanding now. It's clicking to what y'all do. That's
Yeah.
where I was like, okay, I get it now.
Okay.
So all you listeners who figured it out way before me.
Yeah.
Excuse my lack of science understanding here. Where else should we go from here, Kyle?
I think unless there's something we haven't asked you about, maybe just if there is, now's the time. If not, maybe just an encouragement to our listeners. This can be something that, disease is not always a bright subject, and talking about it is not always fun, but it's important to understand it. And you kind of had a creative spin on it to think about it positively in a way that maybe is a good way to kind of leave with people.
Well, before I leave it with that, if you don't mind, can AJ tell you how hunters can submit their deer for testing?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So there is at least, there's several ways. The easiest way, in my opinion, is to submit your deer head with 4 to 6 inches of neck, still attached, antlers removed if it's a buck, to one of our CWD testing drop-off containers, AKA a 7 cubic foot freezer. There's at least one of those in every county. Some counties have more than one. Go to our website to find out the locations and hours of operation. We also partner with taxidermists to take samples. And again, we didn't talk about it here, but they're important to us because they get their hands on those older age class bucks. Older age class males have a higher probability of having the disease.
Sure.
And then if you if your taxidermist doesn't partner with us, or you want to do your own taxidermy or a European mount, you can call one of our regional offices and make an appointment to have your animals sampled, and we can give you the head back, so that way you don't lose the antlers. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. But our website has all that information.
Yeah.
Yep. And an interactive map that shows where all those freezers are.
Okay.
But I think what you were alluding to was, and I didn't say this earlier, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So the best thing we can do is to not move diseases around to the best of our ability, or to catch them early, if nothing else, which requires surveillance and it requires vigilance. But when we're proactive about wildlife diseases, then we can say that we are actually managing for wildlife health. When we're thinking about having the proper nutrition and the proper components in their habitats and their ecosystems, so that we minimize stress, we don't introduce new diseases, and we really manage for healthy wildlife populations, then we can feel better. We can feel good about the resource that we're going to hand down to future generations.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that.
And you're also recommending take your limit of deer.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Y'all hear that?
It's a great recommendation.
It is.
Take your limit.
Yep.
It's important.
Don't do the average of like 1.2 deer. Fill out your bag. Get them all tested.
That's the average in the state, 1.2?
It's like 1.2 or 1.3.
No way.
Yeah, like most people kill 1 deer.
Oh.
Yeah.
1 to 2.
1 to 2, yeah.
A lot of people still won't kill does.
Yeah.
We need you to take does.
Mm.
They're delicious.
And nutritious. It's
They
like,
are.
as far as we were just talking with somebody, regenerative agriculture, and how an orange 50 years ago has 20% of the vitamin C, or now today, an orange has 20% of the vitamin C of an orange 50 years ago.
Yep.
And there's like the best nutritious meat you can find is likely wild venison.
After you test it and make sure it doesn't have CWD.
Look at there.
Look at this guy.
We've done our job today.
That one was locked away for a long time.
Good deal.
But it's a good reminder.
Absolutely. If people have questions that we didn't ask, how can they reach out to you guys, or what's the best way to get those answered?
agfc.health@agfc.ar.gov. That's an email address that gets monitored not quite 24/7, but regularly. And that's a great place to send questions, great place to send sick animals that they see that they've got questions about, or general questions about wildlife.